to a Heritage Week lecture. I presume some of you have been at some other events that have been going on around the county, because there's quite a few and some very, very enjoyable ones. But this is Tipperary Library's offering to Heritage Week, and I hope you will enjoy it. And Lee was with us earlier on today, and we got a little preview of the slides, and from looking at those, I think we're in for a very, very entertaining evening. So on your behalf, I would like to introduce Lee. Lee Downey was Director of Cloggish, and he has been retired for the last 8 years. He's a native of Cork, and he is presently writing a book on the history of butter. So a warm Tipperary welcome to a Cork man, please.
And thank you for that welcome. As I was explaining to Mary today, I have more friends in Tipperary than you really realise. Now, I'm going to talk about the history. We're writing a book on the history of butter. We're about half it done. And I'm going to try and give you a bird's view of the history of butter in Ireland across more than 2,000 years. We probably have the oldest butter in the world. So to start, butter was the staple food of Ireland. You can forget that for a moment. I won't go on for a second. Butter was the staple food of Ireland from prehistoric times, way, way back. We have butter that's dated to the Iron Age, the time of Christ, and we have butter dated before that, to the Bronze Age. Now, way back from that time, we made very large amounts of butter. Butter was the staple common food of the ordinary people. In earliest times, through all the medieval period, and up to modern times. We were so good at it that shortly after the Vatican sale in 1600, we were actually exporting butter. That was one of the first times we did that. Now, Professor Lucas, and I want to thank Seamus O'Shea-Cohn, who brought this to my attention last week, I had forgotten about it, did a very, very, very comprehensive review of the history of butter, based on sagas, based on everything. And I'm just going to reiterate to you his conclusions, because it says everything much more eloquently and much more emphatically than I could say. This is Lucas talking in 1960. Virtually every source of information that he looked up, in virtually every age, from ancient times, medieval times, recent times, emphasised the importance of butter in Ireland. In terms of food products, it's probably not an overstatement to say that Ireland and butter are almost synonymous, and sometimes I think it should become part of our national logo. Now, I'm going to try and cover 5 aspects of butter across that time. I'm going to start with very ancient butter in a few moments that farmers dug up on the bog. Then in the second part, I'm going to deal with butter making and butter marketing in the 1800s, when I will be particularly stressing the central role of women in butter making and marketing. I want to talk about how we marketed butter at that time. We had 2 ways of doing it: country markets and public markets. Then I'm going to come to the 2 largest public markets that existed in Ireland at that stage. I'm going to talk quite a bit about the Cork Butter Exchange, not so much because I'm from Cork, but because we have more information about how that operated than we have about some of the others. And then I'm going to spend some time when I will be drawing on what has been written by local historians here, Jenkins and Murnane. I'm going to talk about what we know about the Tipperary butter market, which was the second largest in the United Kingdom. And then I'm going to do something that I found very interesting myself, and I hope you do. There were great similarities between the 2 markets, between the Cork market and the Tipperary market. But there were also profound differences in how they operated, and I'm going to try and explain that to you. So let's begin the lecture properly by looking at butter in ancient times. As many of you will know, farmers have been digging up butter in the bogs for quite a long time. And when we got involved in this research in 1997, a woman called Caroline Earwood from the UK had gone to the National Museum in Ireland and in Scotland and had documented how many samples there were. And at that time, she was able to document 227 samples of bog butter in the National Museum in Ireland. And what's very interesting, there was also bog butter found in Scotland, which of course is what you would expect. There was a lot of interaction between the two. Now, just to show you how funny this story is, I don't think you would see Mayo as a place that would produce a lot of milk or a lot of butter for that matter. And yet the largest number of bog butter samples, 52, have been in Mayo. Now I happen to think that Cork might not be the home of Ireland, but it's certainly the home of butter. And yet, no bog butter samples have been found in Cork, at most once. I'm going to try and explain why that is so. Now, the butter in the bog was found in a whole variety of forms. Sometimes just wrapped in straw, sometimes in cloth, but very often in little containers like this, and they're called medals. Now, I want you to look at it carefully, because it should remind you of something that you're remembering now. And so and you'll see it better in the next one. Does anyone, you all recognize it? Do you recognize it? What is it? It's the McCarthy Cup. And you will see that. Now, I have no way of knowing definitely that the McCarthy Cup was modelled on these kind of little churns that the bog water was dug up in. But I'd be prepared to stick out my neck and say it's very likely that it was. I think you have to admit, when you look at the handles, when you look at when you've done it in the McCarthy Cup, whenever we see it again, and you will see a striking similarity. And I think that's very interesting, really. And wasn't it very assuming that I'm right, wasn't it very imaginative of the GA to do something like that? And when we came up with this, they didn't know they'd actually done it, and they took a long time to believe us. We got help from the Tipperary, a man called Michael Maher, who I'm sure you all know, we're back. And he was, I think he was Munster chairman at that stage, and he got them to believe that we weren't making this up. So, the next one. Now, we dated the water, and I'll come back and show that in a second. We dated about 30 samples. And they went from, that should be BC. They went from about 200 BC before Christ, right up to about 1800. Now, it raises the first question, was there a practical reason for putting the butter into the bog? Farmers are very practical people. They wouldn't do it for fun. You could say, yeah, well, the temperature was fairly constant, so that was one objective. Yeah, it would keep the butter from getting greasy on a warm day. It wouldn't preserve the butter. The acid conditions would have preserved the butter to a tiny degree. But you have to realise at that time that butter was pretty unhygienic. There was a lot of cow feces in it. So it wouldn't last very long, anyhow. Now there's a lot of other stories that have removed unwanted flavours and there may be some truth or right in that it conferred certain flavours on the butter, because some people talk about it, sorry if I'm in your way, some talk about it giving a garlic type flavour to the butter. So maybe. Now here's the first question now, and now there's a strong hint on that graph, on that picture, as to why I think they put the butter into the bog. If you look at it for a moment, you will see that the vast majority of the bog water samples are west of the Shannon. Oh yeah, there's quite a few in Tipperary here. But predominantly it is west of the Shannon. And yet we're varying today on this side of the Shannon. Of course the temperature might be different. The climate might be different. But there might be another explanation. 52 samples in Mayo, 17 in Downey, 19 in Galway, 10 in Kerry. Well over half the samples of bog water are over in the west of Ireland. Was there a different tribe or a different culture or a different ritual going on there? You might be thinking about that. Of course, I know what you want to say. For goodness sake, you know there's loads of bog fancy really at all, right? Now we ate the butter, and we had expected that the butter would date mainly to about 1200, 1300, 1400. Why? I'm sure many of you will have heard about women and girls taking the animals up the hill, the cows up the hill during the summer, on booling, or called transhumans, where they had to separate the animals from the crops, or they didn't have electric fences. So they had to separate them, and they took the animals, and of course they get into the pasture, etc. And what did they do? They milk the cows, they made butter. What they did was the butter went into a churn, what they did was the churn was turned into a stream, you would flash it out, and the butter was gone. So I thought really we would, but that didn't happen. We gave 30 samples, and you can see they came out predominantly to the Iron Age over there. Yeah, some came out later, but we thought they'd all come out here. And that surprised us. And we would put that fact with the fact that the butter is mainly in Mayo and the rest of Ireland. You should be able to figure out now what the answer is. And this will even help you a bit more. As you would have seen from the television in recent years, they have been digging up bodies of human beings in the bogs. You've seen it on the television. And it's not quite the same distribution, but there's a significant overlap between where the bog bodies are found and where the bog butter is found. Are you beginning to find the answer? Well, as you know, the bodies, the people who were buried in the bog, were killed for ritual reasons and buried in the bog. But the answer is really more or less in the next slide. If you look at where they found the bog bodies and where we got the bog butter from, an awful lot of the time was on the boundary of townlands or barnlands. Now these were kind of sacred places. So what I'm beginning to tell you is that just like the putting of bog bodies into the bog was a ritual purpose, the same was probably true of bog butter. So why was butter buried in the bog? There's a lot, and we were talking about it on the way, about the importance of fairies in the show, but I'll skip all that because we're taking it too long to win, because I've been very tempted. But I'll skip all that really. But I think what happened was this. Ireland was densely populated in the Bronze Age, up to about 300 BC. Very densely populated, and suddenly the population disappeared. Why? No one knows. It might have been famine, it might have been anything. But the country virtually became depopulated during the Iron Age, during the time of Christ, a couple of hundred years before and afterwards. And that frightened people, as you can imagine. And they thought that the best thing they could do was make offerings to gods. So what did they do? They took their valuable necklaces and broke them and threw them into the bog. They broke and bent their swords. They threw all their valuables, a lot of their valuables, into the druids as an offering to gods in the hope that whatever had caused this population to disappear might be corrected. I think they also saw butter as a very valuable commodity. And they put it into very nice containers, like in the carpet cup, and they buried it in the bog. So I think the purpose of putting the butter into the bog was as an offering to the gods. There might have been other purposes. Now, I want you all to go back to your leaving cert chemistry for about 2 minutes. Okay? I promise not to take more than 2 minutes in this. But how does bog butter compare to normal butter? Well, first of all, what does it look like? It looks in all different ways. But just imagine it was a big lump of potty. You wouldn't be inclined to eat it. Some would as hard as well. So, let's look at this chemistry. I have fresh butter there in the middle. And you can see it's 88% fat. But bog butter is much higher in fat. It's nearly entirely fat. Why? Well, ordinary butter has a lot of water, 10-15%. It's very little. Very interesting. Ordinary butter has 2% salt and non-dairy. I'll come back to that. And then protein. So it isn't a fat butter, but it is butter. Now this is the only bit of art chemistry now. If you could see what a molecule of fat looked like under a microscope, it would look like the letter E. Like that, right? Like the letter E. But there would be short arms in it, medium length arms, and long arms. And that's what butter looks like. So the arms are just carbon atoms, 1, 2, 3, just a string of carbon atoms. Now, in the bog, a scissors comes along and chops off the arms. And that's what you see in the next slide. There's a scissors that explain what this is meant. And you have that scissors in your stomach too. The scissors comes along and chops off the arms. The short arms are very weak, so they're gone quickly. Not only are they gone quickly, but they're very soluble in water, so they get washed away. They're gone. After a while, the same thing happens to medium arms. It takes a longer time. They get chopped off, and they get washed away. So what are you left with? Just long, long chains of carbon called fatty acids. Now, because they're an acid, they interact with calcium salt in the soil, and you end up with salts of long-chain fatty acids. When I was in school, the definition for a salt, and many of you remember, a salt is a long-chain fatty acid of a calcium salt. So what has happened? The bog has converted the butter into salt. That was not the purpose of it, right? But that's what it did. And if you gave a sample of bog butter to a chemist, not only would he never identify it as butter because it's completely degraded, he wouldn't even identify it as a fat because it's no longer a fat because the arms are chopped off. And that's all you have left. Now, very interestingly, that reaction that happens in the bog is what's happening in the butter that you eat today. You have that scissors in your stomach, and you have a very large amount of it. And it's also in biological recursion, that's how they remove stains. And it's an enzyme called lipase, after the word lipid, the Latin word for fat. And you have that in your stomach, and that's what it is to the butter and fat you eat today. That same enzyme is in the bog, but in very low concentrations. So really, the bog deals with the butter just like your stomach did, and therefore it's no way that we say to be preserving the butter. It digests the butter. Now, moving on a little bit, I want to come to salt. Now, when we make butter today, we put 2% salt in it, but the bog butter had no salt in it. Why? Was it washed out? Not really. Some of these samples of bog butter are quite big, like the size of a bucket. And it wouldn't be easy for the water in the bog to get into the centre and wash it out, and yet there is no salt at the centre. Well, I think that the salt at that stage was much too precious to be used for preserving food, so they didn't use salt. But that raises the question, is how did they preserve the butter? They preserved the butter because when they got the cream from the milk, they fermented the cream. The fermentation produced acid. Lactic acid, like you had in your egg and your plant. The fermentation produced acid, and the acid stopped the bacteria from growing. So because it was acidic, there was something already in the fermented butter that prevented the bugs from growing, so you didn't need to put in salt. Of course, what you all know, maybe what you all don't know, is that that's still the situation today. Across the whole world today, there are 2 types of butter. This is a secret now among farmers. No one knows this, even though everyone knows. All over the world, there are 2 types of butter today. In the former Commonwealth countries, Ireland, Canada, the UK, Australia, Scotland, they make butter like we do. They take the cream, they put salt into it, and that's how they preserve the butter. But every time you go to a continent, I'm sure you have noticed that the butter tastes more like ice cream there than it does here. It tastes completely different. Why? Because they ferment the cream. And the fermentation produces acid, and they don't need to put in salt. So what I'm really telling you is that in ancient times, the type of butter we were making was continental butter. I might come back to that again, and it didn't need salt. Now I'm going to move now to talk about butter making on farms and the role of it. Now, butter was made on farms, and many of you will know this, from way back in the 1600s through the 1800s. In fact, it was by means of the butter that small farmers paid the rent for a very long time. The butter paid the rent. We often say now that they kept pigs because he was the gentleman who paid the rent. Before that, it was the butter that paid the rent. Now, how was it done? They held them for a few days until the cream rose. They held it in dishes. Now, that would take a little bit of time, but they had firkins then. I'll show you what a firkin is in a minute. It might take them days or a week to fill a firkin. In fact, if you were a small farm with, say, 4 cows, you could probably fill a firkin every month. You probably could fill a half dozen firkins throughout the summer period. If you were a large farmer, and I'm talking about a particular farm in Tipperary now, not too far from here, 70 cows, he was producing 25 firkins per month, 150 firkins throughout the summer period. On these bigger farms, you can see they could make the butter more quickly. They didn't have to hold it to fill the churn. And most of them had dairies, and that produced a more hygienic butter. And that was the way it was. Now, moving now to the marketing of butter. You can hold that for a while because I don't need to. Show me what the next one is from yeah, hold that for 1 minute. How about the marketing of butter? We have made the butter now, we've got to get it to the market. There really were 2 markets in general. There were country markets and there were public municipal markets where the butter was weighed and inspected. And that's what the Tipperary town was, one of them. So there were country markets. Buyers from Cork, Limerick, Waterford, everywhere purchased butter in small towns and villages at country markets. Having agreed to sell, they arranged the transport to their private stores in cities and towns where they inspected and graded the butter. You could imagine it mightn't be as impartial as would happen in a public situation, and they bypassed the public inspections. We were talking about this now beforehand. There's a little issue that I'm kind of a bit interested in, maybe too interested in. How did the butter get into the butter markets in Cork or Tipperary town? And my grandmother, when I was young, she would tell us every Friday night about all the farmers that used to pass by their place in Macroom, carrying butter into Cork. And I'm sure she wasn't making it up. She would tell us this after reading Kitty the Hare stories for the night of the rain or like that. But anyhow, she'll tell us all these stories. Now, if you were living out in Bantry, which is a fair bit from Cork, it would take you 3 days to take a couple of churns of butter into Cork, 3 days on the way back. And as you were saying, you could be hijacked by highwaymen and you would be back. Farmers always thought there were things to do than that, right? So what I think they did, butter buyers came out from the butter markets, bought the butter from the farmers in Cork, but not in Tipperary nor in Mackinac. Now the butter buyers owned the butter. In fact, they had finances during the summer anyhow. And if you had done that, you would make sure that that butter got safely in Cork. And what you would do is you would hire carters to take the butter into Cork. And I believe that there were people carting the butter into Cork. But if you were living within a short distance of it, you might maintain yourself. But there was another picture here. Railways were very important in getting the butter to the Tipperary market. And in Rathkeane, and talking Limerick again, and Shancolville, they put it on the rail. It was on the Limerick stores the next morning, and it was graded and inspected at the private stores and bypass the public markets. Now it's the public markets that I really came to talk about, because I think these are the important things. What do they do with public markets? They were markets set up by the local authorities, or explained by later. They weighed the butter, they inspected it, they graded it and branded it. And that was done not so much for the domestic trade, but for the home trade mainly. There were two prominent butter markets during that. One was the Cork Butter Exchange, which was the largest commercial butter business in the world. And that's not an over-Cork statement now, really, I'll back that up in a minute. And the second biggest in the United Kingdom was in Tipperary town. I'm going to, towards the end of the lecture, compare the two of them, and while they had marked similarities, they had quite big differences as well. Now, this is the only graph I'm going to show. That date there of 1800 is very important, because all had nothing to do with the famine. All of agriculture changed at that time. It was because the Napoleonic Wars were over between Britain. And what really happened, you can see the price, you can see that grain production dropped away altogether. But one thing that remained stable during all that time was the products that were made in small farms. Butter, potatoes, pigs, and eggs. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that. Now, women play an enormous role in these small farm businesses. I'm not going to talk much about poultry, but I have to, because they play this role. Women made a significant income from eggs and poultry, selling them to local traders. I'm going to show you a grand picture of one in a minute. And Horace Downey, who was a very innocent man, and decided he would help the women, and he would set up poultry co-ops. It was great, really, until the payment. And now what happened? Instead of the women getting the money directly from the trader, it was included in the creamery check. Now I think you can work out the rest for yourself. The women weren't exactly amused, and they stopped selling eggs and poultry. And Horace didn't understand this at all. I didn't understand it at all. And he said, Irish women were outrageously bad cooperators. Now, eggs, we were the main supplier of eggs to the British market. But then we lost the market, and of course the women were once again blamed. Why? Because when the price of eggs were good, the women just held on to the eggs. And of course the quality went down, and of course the women were blamed for losing the market. Now, I think this is an outstandingly important figure. By 1914, nearly all, a lot of crops were in existence, a very high percentage of the dairy crops. But even at that stage, 60% of the butter was still made on farm. It's an awful surprising figure. And of course, it made by women. This is a very common scene that you would have seen in any house up to the 50s, women looking after poultry. I think on the next slide I'm going to be looking after geese. I got that up because a friend of mine from County Limerick, from just outside Limerick City, they had where the universities. They had a big farm there. And I was in school with him. And he was telling me that they kept a lot of geese. And he was telling me that every year they would pluck geese alive. Or they're down. Now I never really believed it, but it's now well documented that that is what they did. Not a very pleasant task. Not a very pleasant task. Now, this is the kind of gentleman that the women like to be selling the eggs to. I think this is a great picture. It's really telling them an awful lot. But this is the person that gave the money directly to the women for the eggs and the poultry. That would also have been a scene that would have been very common. Some of you will recall it. You can see, well, you obviously can see the dresser and the cradle and the bed. I'm going to be coming back to this churn in a minute, this dash churn in which they made butter. And these are some of the utensils. That's a woman finishing making a butter, salting it. These are women again selling eggs and poultry in Galway. I think the date is about 1860. Again, you can see the Germans going. But this is my favourite photograph. What's very interesting about this photograph is two things. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, that's a wide. There's 9 women in that photograph and 2 token men. I think that's a great picture. It's caught 1990, 89. But not only are there just 2 token men who don't seem visually anyhow, there was a large lines of butter that were bringing to market, and that's only a roadside market. Now, another little bit about this. We're a tiny island. What was quite surprising is that in the 1880s, we made butter in 2 different ways in this island. From Dublin south, we removed the cream, we churned the cream, we made butter. But from Dublin or Downey, they didn't do that at all. They churned all the milk. Now, wouldn't you think that's a particularly stupid thing to do because they have to? And they're moving an awful lot of water around the place. But why did they do it? Very simply. When you skimmed milk that time, there's 3% fat in milk at that time. At least 1% stayed in the skim milk, so you lost it. It wasn't converted into butter. But if you churn the whole, you got much more butter. They got 20% more butter. We move on again. Yeah. These are some of the churns. It's a dash churn. These were different. Sometimes they were straight up and down. This is a more modern churn. The next one is one that I remember seeing when I was very young. Tumble churn. They were in. And the next one is one that really was in use up to the 1950s. When I went to Moore Park in the 1960s, there was one of these done and we worked on it. Now, making the butter. There you have a woman making the butter on one of these churns. A more sophisticated one. In fact, I think that picture is England. But this is the one I want to talk about. Up to about the 1960s, when I was running a club, and before that, the County Community Agriculture, and after that, Taggart, we had poultry instructors. Butter instructors. We had poultry instructors. But we had women, girls, that went around the farms teaching people how to make hygienic butter. I have no basis for what I'm going to say, but I bet you that was one of our staff. She looks very like a civil servant. And these are the family that she was showing. Now I'm going to come to the Cork Water Exchange and then Tipperary. And I'm going to show a lot now about Cork. Well, for obvious reasons. But mainly because I want to talk later about Tipperary and how different and how similar it was. This is a tremendous photograph, really. And can you see it in the back?
Yeah.
This is a drawing in a Dutch museum and it is dated 1705. And it tells you everything that I'm going to tell you tonight. First of all, you see it's the south coast of Ireland. There's a woman milking a cow in the corner of the field. There's a woman making butter with one of these churns I showed you. It wasn't made in the field, of course, it was made inside. There is a very un-Irish-looking Irishman bringing the made butter over to a very un-Irish-looking Irish woman, but she's Irish. And they're packing it into the curtains. And of course, these are the bondholders. These are the butter buyers and the exporters who really made money out of the whole thing, and doesn't their address actually tell you that? This is a Perka. If Irish butter was ever going to have a logo, this is it. This is what the butter was put into. Originally £56, some of them went up to £70. They were making mistakes and moves around. This now is the Cork Water Exchange in about 1850. It's a very elegant building, I think you would agree. Very impressive. Just at the foot of Canada. What are these? I think these are workers. Now, very quickly, the exchange in Cork had 2 existences. It was set up in 1769, and it survived for a century and a half. A remarkable outcome. Right? At first it was run by a committee of merchants, or a subcommittee of them. It got into financial trouble. They did what we do today, they replaced the board and put in a new board, the board of trustees, and they ran around 24. This is the board of trustees. Now I want you to look at these gentlemen, and I think you can discern that those in the front row, and even those in the second row, are distinctly different from those in the back row. I think the people in the front row were the exporters, really, the people who really made money out of it. The merchants, princes of court. Barry's tea was one of them. And I think these were the buyers who were all modest, but that's not, that. Now, what did they do in the exchange? And I'm only telling you this because we're going to come to it in Tipperary in a minute. They inspected the butter, they priced the butter, they were like a bank. They gave credit to farmers so they could actually feed themselves during the summer. But that really meant when the butter was made, they owned the butter. And they ensured the supply of butter. Now, the butter buyers are the middlemen. And they're very interesting in this context. What they did is they went out and they purchased the butter out from farmers. They had given them loans anyhow, right? So they owned the butter. So therefore, when they get cargoes to bring it safely into Cork, they own much of the butter not through the exchange. What did they do at the exchange? I kind of said this, they inspected the price, gave out credit, they supplied, and they had different types of butter, which would take me too long. Just primarily salted Kirkland butter. And that's the message from Cork. And I'll come to this again. We made salted Kirkland butter. And if you didn't want that, you could go to it. Right? That was the story of the Cork Bridge. Now this is the inside of it. You will see there's about 1850, very impressive building, all the Kirkland's laid out. But it really wasn't like this is a bit of a con job, really, as I'll explain in a second. There's only for the photograph. Because you will see that in and around the church, you have nothing but inspectors. If you would see these things close up, you will see that he has a thing for taking a core out of the butter, so they could taste it. And every one of them has that. But who are these? These are the butter buyers. If you went around on a normal day, not only will they not be separated from the inspectors, but they'll be standing behind their backs in case they should make a mistake. In case they shouldn't grade that butter high enough. Now, if they're great, mid-80s, 1880s, getting into trouble, began perhaps in 1870. Why? We were the main suppliers of butter to the British market for about 50 years. Now butter was coming in from the continent. It was of better quality, it was of a lower salt content, and we couldn't handle the competition. That's what it meant. There was also consistent complaints about the quality of butter from Cork, notwithstanding all the inspection, too much salt, too much moisture, dirty Birkin. We made salt at Birkin, or in Trinidad and all that, and we go somewhere else. And there were operational weaknesses, but, and this is modern now. This is modern Ireland we're talking about now in the 1800s. There was a stubborn resistance to change. Does that not sound a bit modern? A stubborn and absolute resistance to change. And innovation was a four-letter word, don't mention it in Concord. Right? So the mines was in the late 1800s, there were fundamental problems, and now we've introduced that to butter blending factories, which started up about that time. They would buy bad butter and good butter and blend it and make it into better butter. And the Cork butter market was annually dealing with about half a million Kirklands per year. In 1 year, they lost 100,000. Then the creameries came in, and that accelerated their demise. People who were previously clients of the exchange now became clients of the creamery. They now had much reduced supplies. And you were talking about marginal areas as well. Now the Cork butter market was reduced to dependent on supplies from marginal areas of West Cork and South Kerry, and they were getting some from Limerick and Tipperary too. Now this is something that I have more than a casual interest in because of my grandma. How does butter get into Cork? Now, all are certain roads that are known as butter roads. Not because they were built for carrying in butter. In fact, they weren't. They were toll roads. But they were mainly used for bringing in butter. And there's loads of stories in the literature about troops of men and horses bringing in firkins of butter. And they're known as the butter roads. Now, one of them is that butter road, or as they say in Cork, that butter road, right? And it's the old Kerry, and it runs from Cork, Mill Street, Kerry, to Killarney. It was a turnpike road, but I want to deal with this bit. Halfway between Cork and Kerry, there's what's the Kerryman Table. It's just a big rock. And it's well known that farmers brought their butter, took this big rock, and handed it over to carters at that point. Now I think that the equivalent of Kerryman tables existed in other parts of the country, and I'm trying to research them. And you said I'm wrong, and I could be. But I have often wondered, the creamery stops that you put the cans of milk up to in the 60s and 70s, I've often wondered, were they originally when they brought their butter down? They weren't concrete then or anything like that. But was there a tradition about bringing product to that area? I don't know. Here are the butter roads in Cork. There's the ones running up into Killarney. That's where the Kerryman Table is, and these are the ones running into South Cork. And I wonder if there's any tradition of butter roads in Tipperary. Now, to bring the Cork Butter Exchange to an end, I did something which is kind of a bit dangerous. I'm sorry for the jargon. I did a SWOT: strength, weaknesses, opportunities, threat. That's kind of a model in jargon. If you were brought in to evaluate a library there, we would do a SWOT analysis on it: its strengths, its weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And why did I do that? For a very, very simple reason. If you read the literature about the Cork Butter Exchange, depending who's talking about it, it was either brilliant or ridiculous. There's no in between. And the reason for that is that even the best of historians, when you look up their source, it was the newspaper. So it was anecdotal evidence. And you can imagine what the Farmer General might be saying about something like an exchange. One day when it suited the Farmer General, the exchange would be great, the next day when it didn't, it wouldn't be so great. I was going on the receiving end of that for a long, long time. So I did this analysis and tried to look at it retrospectively, subjectively, but I have some experience on how these things operate. Now, where are we going? Yes, it was an unrivaled success for a very long time. Some important milestones. I mean, these are really remarkable achievements. Early 1800s, they had a monopoly on the butter in the West Indies and in Brazil. It was sending enormous amounts of butter to the Caribbean as state food. Then they discovered that there was to be a market in Australia. Australia wasn't making butter at that time. And some of the Cork merchants really made serious money. That's where they started, sending butter to Australia. Then they became the largest supplier in Britain. From the mid-80s up to then, they continued to prosper. Why didn't they? They were getting butter from 70 to 80,000 farmers. An awful lot. The very few creameries could say that today. Okay, they're smaller. And they were handling in excess of 400,000 firkins, nearly 500,000 per annum. What did they do? They inspected the butter. That's the main thing they did. They introduced a very strict, innovative inspection system. That was the first time that was kind of done. And something that was not Cork first was in a very high regard in Liverpool, Lisbon, Jamaica. And in fact, there was only butter from Cork that was not Cork first. That was sent first of all to Liverpool and then sent all over the world. Very high regard for it. I think everything was the best at the time that they could do in terms of inspection, but it wasn't at all as reliable as Cambridge. That's exaggerated, really. Now, why wasn't it as good? What do you like to guess how many samples an inspector had to inspect per hour over 8 hours a day? 120 to 150 samples of butter per hour. Just imagine that, going in and running on. And for the next 8 hours, you have to taste 100 hours, 100 samples of butter every hour. Couldn't do it, really. And just in case you made a mistake, the butter owner was standing outside you anyway, right? So, nonetheless though, it's not fair either to ridicule it, it was probably as good as could be done at the time. And I was telling a former colleague of mine who was here in the audience, it might have been, in fact, as good as some of the modern inspections that we have. For instance, the inspections of reactors, TB reactors, at feed plants. I think an awful lot of you would know more about that than I do. And I think an awful lot of you would definitely tell me that it was absolutely brilliant, totally reliable, never makes a mistake. I think it was at least as good as that. Now, we're going to handle the top of the competition. European butter now became highly scientific and technological. They began to make the first type of margarine called butterine in France. It almost seems like an Irish word, really. But what it was a mixture of animal fat and butter. And they sent a lot of that into Britain. And we got the space out of the market. Then, like we saw the butter came into Britain, we got pushed out of the market. Moreover, they began to revolutionize butter making in the continent. It was no longer done in farms, it was done in creameries. But the Cork Butter Exchange, we have none of that. They made salted Fertin butter, and they didn't want to hear anything about this land whatsoever, right? Now, there was a resistance to change. They were wedded to salted Fertin butter, as was Tipperary town. They were wedded to salted Fertin butter. They failed to address customer complaints. They were sold in much more unreliable rates of butter and dirty Fertin. And yet, all that was required was reliable weights on the Fertins, lightly salted butter, and something other than Fertins, but no. There were conflicts of interest that led to that. The exchange system was driven by butter buyers. I should have said that earlier. There were two groups of people on the board. Remember now, it was an exporting body. There were exporters and butter buyers, which is the butter buyers were on top. They ran the show. I'll explain why in a second. They were still behind the butter, which was being inspected to make sure that they got as high a grade as possible. They had other excuses. Now, do you know what they did? When the butter was inspected, it was divided into 6 categories. And every morning that happened, and they hold a mock auction with the exporters to get a feel for what the going price for the day is, and then they threw up the exporters. And then they, the butter buyers, set the price for each of the 6 grades. That was bad enough. They now invited the exporters back in to buy the butter. The exporters were not allowed to buy only grade 1 and grade 2. They had to buy some of the bad butter as well. But of course that made sure that the butter buyers weren't stuck with bad butter. But they did put bad butter into the market. So much for the inspection system, which was so brilliant. They persisted with Fertins. Why? Because the butter buyers had invested a fortune in the Fertins. And of course the trade union of the Coopers and Cork were also very strong, and they wanted Fertins to continue to be used. Other countries were using these things. You remember these butter boxes, what we saw with that. It definitely was a great success. It had its weaknesses, but these weaknesses were not unique to the Cork butter market. They were a common problem in other organisations at the time, and I think we now know that some of these problems still persist in organisations in Ireland. So we have to get a little balance into what we're saying about. Final endeavour. They tried, when the Cork Butter Exchange was set up, there was a lot of legal basis for it, inspection, and they tried to get these legal bases restored, but the Cork operation wouldn't have it. And it stayed sealed when they were unable to transform it. It came to a rapid end, and as you will see in the next slide, the next one after that, that's what's left of there, and it's a fitting monument to what it was like. And now I want to switch to Tipperary. Now, go back to the 1%. I want you to look at this carefully. There's about 10 minutes left now. I'm going to wrap it up on that. That's the inside of the Cork Butter Exchange, about 1850. Do you notice anything? Did farmers go to the market in bowler hats? Did farmers go to the market in top hats? Did farmers go to the market in straw hats? No. They put all the straw hats, they put all the bowler hats, not too many peak hats. Farmers had very little involvement in the Cork Butter Exchange, but let's move to Tipperary. Now there are some bowler hats, but I think I wouldn't have any trouble in convincing you that an awful lot of these people are farmers. Not only are there farmers, but there are women. There's one there, I could show you that, I have a better photograph. There's one there too, and there's one back here. It's a completely different scene. And that's where I want to talk about that. Now, in the Tipperary market, I'm not going to go into it in too much detail. In the 1880s, the butter trade in Tipperary market was 160,000 tonne firkins per annum. Now, about a third of those were sold outside the market, but 100,000 tonnes were sold in the market. Now, there was a butter building in Tipperary town, in Church Street, in 1852. No one knows when it was set up, but I've done a little research on it, and I'd be pretty certain it was there in 1829, if not before. I'd be fairly certain of that. What did they do in the exchange? First of all, it was run by a committee of 6 merchants and 6 farmers were on the board. Sorry, 7 farmers were on the board. 7 merchants, 7 farmers. It had employed an inspector, a weighmaster, an assistant operator, scales, and a valet to sweep the floor. But as you will see now from that, farmers sold the firkins of butter, top butter merchants, not exporters, in the exchange. Inside in the exchange, farmers sold the butter to butterers, not in Cork. The butter was then sold on to exporters at ports, and it was a hell of a good business in the 1850s. In 1850 it was 300,000 per annum, old money, and in 1878 it was double that. But now we get to the questions. If you sent the butter to Tipperary town market, you paid a toll of 3.03 per firkin. If you sent the butter to the private merchant store, you didn't pay any toll. So why would you send the butter to Tipperary town or down into Cork butter market and pay 3 or 4p? Well, the answer is obvious, I think, that the butter that was inspected in these public establishments got a better price in the market, and that was handed back to farmers, and if that was greater than the price of the tolls, there was an incentive for the farmers to go there. It had to do with the price of water. Who took the butter to Tipperary town? I think the small farmers who really didn't have very good quality butter, and not too much, and they took it to the local country market. I think it was the bigger farmers took the butter into Tipperary and into Cork. They were able to make better butter because they could make it more quickly. They had dairies, etc. They were also on board with the establishments, and I think it was the bigger supply butter from bigger farmers that was supplying the market. Now, the railways were a tremendous benefit to Tipperary town market. These railways were established in the 1850s, and a lot of butter was transported to the Tipperary town market from the 1850s by rail. It now, by the late 1800s, Tipperary town market was the most important market in the whole country. It was the second biggest market in the UK. In 1887, there were 13 butter buyers operating in Tipperary town market, compared to 3 in Canada and just 1 in Cardigan-Shore. There was a lot of competition for butter at that time, and Tipperary was in competition with a market in Limerick, with the trade where people were able to handle that trade. They dropped the price of tolls, and they made the railway transport cheaper in Tipperary than in Limerick, so a lot of Limerick butter came in Tipperary. And they must also have bought some of that butter by road. Now, I want to compare the two butter markets and finish with that. I'm going to repeat a little bit of what have a fair idea of what went on in the two markets. There were similarities. They were both marketing systems for farm-made butter. They were both similar in that they weighed and inspected the butter. They both sold salted firkin butter, but I think that the level of salt was less in the Tipperary than it was in Cork, because Cork had initially been sending the butter out in very warm climates, whereas when Tipperary got involved, it was mainly for export to the UK. So I think, and I know I read somewhere that it was lower, but I couldn't find it before I came down. But there were notable differences in brief trade, in the organisational structure of the markets, totally different, in what they did in the markets, different, but the biggest difference really was in terms of legislation and regulation. As I said, in Cork, the exporters were much more dominant than the farmers. The farmers were hardly to be seen at all. Maybe you go back and you'll see that again. See, there's nearly no farmers there. That's not quite true. I wonder who these guys standing out by the door there are. Or back there. But in the main, farmers had a very low profile. They weren't on the board. It was exporters and buyers. And the buyers, or the exporters, bought the butter inside in the building. Not in Tipperary. It was farmers more than exporters. The butter was sold by farmers to butter buyers, not the exporters. Farmers were on management, and it was a completely different setup. In Cork, there's similarities there now again. The board was 7 butter buyers and 7 exporters. In Tipperary it was 7 and 7 also. But it was 7 butter buyers and 7 farmers. You can see the difference, and you can see it in the pictures. They weighed and inspected the butter, and as I said, the butter was sold by the farmers to the butter buyers in the exchange and then sent off to the ports. But it really was, and this is the part that I want to stress, and this is the part that I've become increasingly interested in, the legislation and regulations that pertained in the two markets were quite different. Before Cork was ever opened in 1770, there was a lot of legislation pertaining to the quality of butter, the quality of the firkin, the amount of salt. And Cork started to make butter for a highly regulated market. Now, as in modern times, nothing is really new, we became very interested in, about 1920, in deregulation. I'm sure you've heard of deregulation there recently. We became very interested in deregulation, and we deregulated everything. And we deregulated the butter market with disastrous consequences, really. So we learned nothing. So by 1829, there was a butter market in Tipperary town and probably before it. But in 1829, everything was deregulated. Now, Cork and Tipperary dealt with that in a significantly different way. Tipperary, as well, they don't do it today. But Cork were a bit more clever than that. Even though deregulation had happened nationally, the Cork merchants decided to have their own voluntary regulations, and they drew up regulations for the Cork market. And while they were voluntary, if you opted in and you didn't stick to them, you were fined or expelled. So they continued to operate a regulated market. Tipperary started to operate a deregulated market. But one way or the other, they both had the same fate at the end. But that regulation, I could talk about for a very long time, is a big issue. So we were in a period of deregulation, and the only crowd that were really sticking with the regulations were the Cork crowd. Now, even when regulations were there of course was a lot of butter sold outside the markets, outside the public. That happened in Cork and Tipperary. There's no doubt about that. But still, I think that in Tipperary more butter was sold outside the public system than in Cork. So where does all this finally get us to? What was the lifespan of the two organisations? The Cork Butter Exchange went from 1770 until 1924. I think that's an extraordinarily long existence. It was coming to the end in the second half of the 1800s, which was about the time that the Tipperary town market was coming into its own. So when the Tipperary town market was coming into its own, Cork was on the way down. They both coexisted for about 75 years. However, the demise of both was well heard of. From 1870, the Cork Exchange couldn't handle the competition. It lost water suppliers. It refused to change. It was wedded to salt and fertile butter, the demand for which was internal at the time. But that was also the main product in Tipperary town. And there was a stark reduction in the amount of butter that they sold in Tipperary town. It was 36,000 cartons in 1892.